Hello, everybody. That is Nikole Hannah-Jones. My name is Vance Lang, and I want to welcome everyone here to our showing here of a little chat with Nikole Hannah-Jones. My name is Vance Lang. As I said, I'm the president of the New York Association of Black Journalists. This event is brought to you by the Society of Professional Journalists, New England chapter, and it's called A Chat with Nikole Hannah-Jones. So if you would allow me a moment to give an introduction to Miss Nikole Hannah-Jones. She is the creator, as you know, most of you know, of the 1619 Project. She's a Gannett Foundation Innovation of Watchdog Journalism winner, National Awards for Education Reporting winner, NABJ Journalist of the Year, the Route 100, a MacArthur Fellow, Distinguished Alumni UNC Chapel Hill, and as of late, Pulitzer Prize winner. So everyone, welcome Nikole Hannah-Jones, please. Nikole, hello.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. So coming up on the anniversary here, actually, of the 1619 project. It's been almost a year since it's debuted, and to this day, as they say, I was just doing a little last minute research, and still a lot of opposition.
Yeah.
This thing. I saw a whole like 10-minute Glenn Beck clip of some trailer that he's about to put out. Anti 1619 project. So now that this year's gone by, you're coming up on the anniversary. You got this criticism going on. You got the thing that is happening in the country with the police brutality, George Floyd, Arbery, uh, just all this stuff coming out. How you doing, sis? How's it going? how, how,
uh,
how you doing this year?
I'm trying to maintain just like everyone else. This is, of course, 2020 has been a year that has proven the thesis of the 1619 Project several times. So people who wanted to argue about racism being in our country's DNA, who wanted to argue about whether the legacy of slavery is ongoing, I think 2020 has confirmed that thesis. I'm fine. I think the amount of criticism has only shown that we did what we were trying to do, which is to really shake up the framing of our country's history and the way that we understand slavery as foundational.
Now we have again. This is a thing where you know. It's like the SNL skit from last year with Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle, where it's like, oh, y'all just figuring this out, like we've been trying to tell you, like that's part of what they say the black people, we're tired of telling white people how to relate to us, or no, you can't see what's going on, and so like it's projects like this where it's like they come out and it's all this criticism, and it's like, no, you don't understand, you don't see what's coming, and then we have these events in succession that just bring
Right.
out. So, how do you react? How do you respond to those criticisms? Because I know you get them all the time. I'm sure your inbox is full. Like, how do you respond to those direct criticisms when they sometimes come after you?
I mean, it depends on the day. Some days better than others. I think what um, a lot of people, I don't know if they don't understand or if they don't really care, but of course, as journalists, we take great pride in our work, and everyone involved in the 1619 Project worked really, really hard on it. So when you see people whose criticism often comes, like, it's clear they haven't read it. It's clear that they've heard what someone else said about it and want to use it, as an opportunity to kind of take a shot at um, me as a journalist, or at the way that we're trying to reframe history. Sometimes I can get a little sensitive to that. But really, I think the work speaks for itself, and the power of the conversation that it's ignited across the country speaks for itself. But, anybody on here who follows me on Twitter knows that some days I react well and some days I don't. I'm a human being. And I'm an Aries, so it's hard for me not to respond when people say things that I think are crazy.
I totally understand that. So, this is a question that was asked one of my VPs. We were having a panel about covering systematic racism and police brutality in the midst of COVID-19, when you're not at work, you're not with your coworkers, you're not able to be in those water cooler chats with your people when something's going on, and you can look around and say, well, let me go talk to my sister.
Right.
So how are you handling that when you're not able to spend as much physical time with the people you're used to talking with?
I mean, it's hard for everyone out here. This isolation is not natural. And, particularly now when the normal ways that you would cope by um, having meetings with your friends or brainstorming meetings with journalists in your office or, just commiserating about all of the ways that we're feeling this, both as just Americans who are having to deal with COVID, that pandemic, and then as Black folks who are also having to watch the COVID pandemic collide with the 400-year racial pandemic of this country. So this isolation has been really challenging for everyone. I don't feel a sense of cohesion with my office. It just seems like it's hard from day to day to even know what's going on at work. And while it's a blessing to have flexibility to work from home, it's not how I've ever chosen to do journalism. I was always a person who came into the office every day if I could, and really thrived off of that kind of collegial environment. So it's definitely challenging. I am zoomed out, even though I'm here with y'all tonight, kind of over all of the Zoom and virtual meetings. And the other thing is it feels like we just are working even more than before. There's no kind of natural delineation between your workday and being at home. And that's definitely been a challenge.
I'm right there with you on that. And my apologies. We have a live stream going out, and they're saying it's a problem with your audio, but it's not you. It's me. It's me.
Oh, okay.
Working on that for my people on the stream. We're working on that. But to continue on with even in that frame, you know, yeah, it's definitely been a challenge to work from home, particularly when it's your escape. Me personally, I'm doing newscasts and news every day, so you're always seeing the presidential briefings and all of these things. So you don't get an escape when you're at home.
Right.
You don't get that walk to the bus and that commute to let go and to unwind. But in that vein, what does Nikole do to unwind? Who are you listening to? What's in the iPod? We kind of old. What's in the iPod?
The iPhone. You're kind of old. Don't put me in that category. Uh, so though I'm about to make myself sound old because I do listen to a lot of 90s R&B. And I really I have Apple Music and I listen to their like hip hop and R&B stations. So it just depends on the mood I am, if I'm feeling angry or if I'm feeling, sad. But it is a strange thing to kind of figure out how do you relax when work is your home. So I try to, when I'm done with my official work day, light my Bath and Body Works 3-wick candle, put on my little light in the living room and leave the office space and go to my living space because it is hard to. I mean, we were already as journalists, checking our devices all the time and never really feeling like we were completely off work. But when the workspace is the home space every single day, and I'm in New York, so we've been on like serious lockdown, like not playing around lockdown. So I don't really leave my house unless we have to go to the grocery store. So everything happens in my house 24 hours a day. I don't leave. I don't have company. So it's kind of hard to figure out how to relax. And I had kind of adapted to it for a while, but then as we saw like these COVID outbreaks happening all over the country in places that they hadn't happened before, then my anxiety is back up because once New York and Connecticut, New Jersey, the states that were hit really hard, Chicago started to see the COVID cases decline, you kind of had the sigh of relief, like, okay, maybe some semblance of normal life might be around the corner. And now that's clear that it's not. We're at 50,000 new cases a day across the country, probably going to get to 100,000 cases a day. So I think it's kind of the unending, like the sense that this is unending is a struggle for everybody.
Yeah, yeah, and even with that, I'm trying to do the.
You are so bootleg right now. I'm just gonna say.
No, don't Teddy Riley me. Don't.
You are having a Teddy Riley moment for real, but we're gonna move on.
And that's kind of the thing with COVID in particular, where you have this this divide of people who, some people just don't believe it. They just don't believe it. And it's creating a dangerous environment for everyone. And I have those same things when I go out when I need to. I go to Walmart and I come home, and it's crazy to see, how many people are just totally disregarding the safety of other people. But my question that I kind of want to get to is, again, we're in this abnormal space right now where, we don't know when school is going to happen again physically. We don't know a lot of things about, just what the new normal is going to be on the other side of this. So besides, I just maybe like to get your outlook on, what you think the other side of this is going to look like for education and for the kids, right now who have been disturbed in their learning and in their, environment. We say the kids are resilient, the kids will bounce back, but this is going to be a big thing for them come in the future.
Yeah, I in general try to avoid making predictions because I don't think any of us really know. And I think as journalists, every time you try to make a prediction, you end up looking stupid, and I don't like to look stupid. So I'm not going to make predictions, but here's what we do know. COVID in every aspect of our society, not just education, but probably particularly education, is simply magnifying all of the inequalities that already existed. So we know the researchers are saying Black kids are going to likely lose about 10 months of instruction, the highest of all racial groups. We already know that Black kids are concentrated in the most under-resourced schools before COVID. When we think about which school districts are going to have the least ability to sustain the budget cuts that are going to be coming down, those are going to be those urban districts that are already serving a very high poverty population. So I think it's going to be really devastating. I don't know how we go back to school in the fall in a place like New York City. Doesn't at this point seem like there's any real plans. And of course, the parents who are already struggling, who can't stay home and tutor their kids all day, are going to be struggling even more. And this whole idea that kids are resilient, that's true. But kids can only withstand so much disadvantage before we know that that has long-term effects on their educational outcomes. So we're already dealing with kids who were already behind before COVID, and now they're going to be even more behind with even fewer resources than they had before COVID started. So I'm actually really, really worried. I don't think we should take any consolation in this idea that kids are resilient. There are a lot of kids who are not going to bounce back from this unless we do a very serious intervention that I am not even seeing being part of the conversations right now.
And I think that's an important thing too, because we talk about, and I know you talk about this a lot, what reparations look like, and people get scared of that word when you. People get scared of that word. Oh, reparations. That means we trying to cut every Black person a check, or, it's like, no, we just want you to fund the schools equally. We want you to, just take care of us the same way you take care of everyone. So with that, and I know, again, that's a part of the second part of being, in that place of trying to figure out where to go with what's next. Here's where we've come from 1619 to now, and this is what we need, and it's not a check in every Black person's mailbox. It's just equality, or as Jon Stewart, as I said to someone the other day, equity.
Well, I mean, I'm calling for a check in every Black person's mailbox. I mean, I really am. Like when we look at the wealth gap, and of course, I just had a piece that came out in the Sunday magazine of the Times making the case that so much of what makes Black lives hard, what makes Black people experience disadvantage in every aspect of life, including education, including healthcare, including unable to withstand job loss. We can just look at the data. Black income gap, the Black-white income gap has remained unchanged for 70 years. The Black-white wealth gap has remained unchanged for 70 years. In the midst of COVID, more than half of all Black adults are out of work right now. About 1 in 4 Black people in this country have missed at least one mortgage or rental payment since COVID, the highest of all racial groups, highest unemployment rate. While unemployment went down for other racial groups, it actually went up for Black Americans. And Black people hold about 10 cents of wealth for every $1 of wealth that white Americans face. And this is, of course, because of the generational inability to accumulate wealth and financial and economic exploitation. So I don't think we should be so quick to dismiss a wealth transfer. There's really nothing else that can resolve the lack of wealth and the disadvantage in this country when you have no wealth than a transfer of wealth to make up for that wealth gap. How do you get equity if Black people have no wealth to buy homes, move into nicer neighborhoods, send their kids to higher quality schools, to get health care, to withstand financial catastrophe? You can't have equity as long as Black people continue to face such a severe economic wealth poverty.
Copy that. Cut that check. I'm gonna shift gears a little bit. No pun intended, but sort of. The SPJNE project about the traffic in Atlanta, I just blew me a little bit. You know, didn't. You know, because I live in a city where one of our Black areas was split by a highway. You know, talk about that a little bit more to the people who don't really understand why you wait in traffic in Atlanta for hours.
Well, not just Atlanta, basically every major city that had a significant Black population. I mean, what we were trying to do with the 1619 Project is really show that all across the spectrum of American life, in ways that are completely surprising, that racism and the legacy of slavery can be seen. And so we looked at, criminal justice is not surprising, but things like why we consume so much sugar, why we're the only Western industrialized country without universal health care, traffic, I think really helped make the case that so much of what makes life for Americans hard has to do with our inability to get over the legacy of slavery. And one of those is traffic. It's really important for us to show like how intentional some of this disorder and chaos we see is. And in communities, cities, particularly urban areas all across the country that had significant Black populations, governments made decisions to build highway systems that fostered segregation. So instead of these highway systems being built to quickly move people from one location to the next, they were actually built when it came to cities to divide Black communities off from white communities. So Atlanta's a great example because you go to Atlanta, you have the 285 loop, makes no sense whatsoever, except if you understand racism, then it makes perfect sense. So you look at why traffic is so bad in a place like Atlanta, why they have no really metro-wide public transit system there. It all has to do with racism and the desire to separate Black communities and keep Black communities from getting access to white suburbs through public transit. And so to me, it was just a great, I see somebody said Robert Moses and the Cross Bronx Expressway, same thing. Go to Chicago, same thing. You see it all over the place. And I think it was a good way of demonstrating that our legacy of slavery and anti-Black racism, we've never been able to contain the harms just to the community who's targeted. So Black people suffer more from it, but it's white people sitting in that traffic too. It's Latinos sitting in that traffic too. So it's not just Black people who suffer. Our inability to get over slavery and address slavery and purge this anti-Black racism from our country means we all suffer. And it's the same thing with universal health care. You know, the fact that we're the only country of the countries we love to compare ourselves who doesn't offer healthcare as a right. There are a lot of white people who don't have access to healthcare because of that. There are more Black people have the highest rates of being uninsured, but there are millions of white people who are also uninsured because of that. The fact that we have the stingiest social safety net in the Western world. There are lots of white people who suffer from that when they can't afford childcare, when they can't afford housing. You know, it's not just Black folks, but we've been willing to sacrifice a significant number of white Americans' quality of life, if that means more Black people are not going to get what we think they don't deserve.
And that's an interesting thing too, because you know, along with the talk of racism, there's also the talk of class.
Yes.
You know, and anyone that knows me and that has this conversation, this is not an original thought I had, but I always say, you know, Black people did not invent the phrase "poor white trash." And there's this sentiment, and again, I grew up in the South, so I got friends who, you know, my heritage is in the Confederacy, and it's like, dude, you don't even know who your great grandfather was, you know. So there's this thing of like, this is not just our history. This is our history. This is our history, all of us, you know. Yes. So, you know, so that's sometimes, you know, I mean, there's ignorance on all sides, but sometimes the opposition to, you know, hey, let's really find out who Robert E. Lee is just rooted in these things where it's like, you don't even know what your great grandfather was doing, you know, or this notion that every single Black person was a slave and every single white person was a slave owner. And it's like, no, some of these disparities also are class-based as well. And some people don't even realize that. They get so, you know, they get stuck on the shiny object of race. Like you say with some white people, they don't realize I'm kicking myself down when I'm speaking against my own interests. How does that, you know, how frustrating is that for you to see on, you know, on the professional level sometimes? Like, I'm sure while you were coming up with this project, you had, I'm sure, some professional resistance from some corners.
I didn't actually.
Didn't? So
I really didn't. No.
Wow. So that's very actually exciting to hear. So it's like, you went to your boss and like, hey, this is what I want to do. And they were just like, let's do it.
I mean, that actually is what happened. Now, I'm not arguing that's the normative experience for a Black person at the Times or any other mainstream news organization, but I have a great relationship with my bosses at the magazine. The magazine has a great deal of independence from the main newsroom. And it's also important, you know, by the time I pitched this project, I have a track record of doing a certain type of journalism. It's hard. Let me just say it was harder at this point to tell me no.
Now that's very exciting to hear. So, in the process of composing this very sweeping, you know, covering 400 years of research, artistic inspiration, you know, and I really just kind of want you to kind of maybe just give us a synopsis of just how hard was it? Because there are so many people involved, so many, you know, there are podcasts, there are, you know, visual displays, there are essays. There's so much that gets encompassed in that how was it just keeping all of that together to get it to completion?
Yeah, I mean, the 1619 project was definitely the hardest thing I've ever done in my career for multiple reasons. One, I'm just a journalist. Typically, I pitch a story, I report a story, I write a story. I'm not a project manager, I'm not an editor. I've never in my life had to kind of project manage anything of this depth and scope. And on top of that, I'm also responsible for writing the lead essay for the 1619 project. And you don't want to have created this big project and then your essay is the weak link. So there was a lot of pressure to really, you know, write a powerful essay for a powerful project. There were so many different pieces to manage, and I felt I had to read every single one. I'm scouring it for language. I was determined we're not gonna, for instance, use the word slaves. We're not gonna call people slave owners, right? Unless it's in direct quote. So I'm reading everything. And then there's just the pressure of how do you do justice to a 400-year story of one of the most marginalized groups in this country? And how do you make sure that you are up to the task of that? And particularly at an institution like the New York Times, where people don't necessarily have a lot of trust that our organization will do something like this right. And people are maybe looking for us to fail at it. And I certainly didn't want to let our communities down in that way. And I didn't want to let our ancestors down. So I cried a lot working on this project, just reading and spending months and months and months into, you know, all of these atrocities, just everything that our ancestors have been through. And it really is unrelenting. If you study this history, it's unrelenting from 1619 all the way to a few weeks ago when another Black man was killed by the police, another Black woman was killed by the police. So it's an unrelenting history. And I definitely was drinking far more than I should have, and I ate far more than I should have. I look at some of my pictures towards the end of the project, and I was like, "Damn, girl, you just let yourself go." It was really stressful. And all big projects are stressful, but this also is a project where you don't get relief from it. You're writing about your own people. You're writing about your people's struggles. So you can't like check out at 6 o'clock and forget about what it is that you're working on, because there's no getting away from it. So yeah, it was definitely the hardest thing, but it was also the most fulfilling thing I've ever done. And when the project released that Sunday, and I started seeing people posting videos. I went to 5 stores to find this, and I finally found a place where it wasn't sold out, or people doing like unboxing videos for a project of journalism about the legacy of slavery. It was, you know, the most fulfilling and surprising thing that I could possibly imagine.
And that's, you know, that's interesting to me in the sense of, you know, I've, you know, been doing a little research and stuff, and I know you come from Iowa, and
Yes.
you said that, you know, your inspiration in high school was your newspaper, the one of your teachers telling you, if you don't like what's in the student newspaper, you know, write an article, you know.
Yes.
So how did that, so that was kind of the catalyst to getting you into journalism. What were some other things around that time that kind of kept pushing you into that direction?
Yeah, so I was, I know you guys will find this very hard to believe, but I was very nerdy as a child. I read voraciously. My father always subscribed to 2 newspapers. We always got our city paper and our state paper. And I really can't remember a time where I didn't read the paper with my dad. And I started subscribing to Time magazine as a middle school student. I still have my copy of when the Berlin Wall came down. So I always loved reading and reading the news. And I got my first letter to the editor published when I was a middle school student. I read a column, and I want to say it was Kathleen Parker, but I don't know that for sure, but I thought it was racist. And so as a middle school student, I wrote a letter and about how I didn't think this column really reflected how Black people were, and they published it. And I just remember feeling really empowered that even as a kid, I could push back on the narrative being written about my community, and that it could actually be published. So I don't know at that age that I was thinking about journalism as a career, but I certainly was always really engaged with news and really understood at a young age that we have to be able to tell our own story. So then, yes, as a high school student, I was bused into a white high school as part of a school desegregation program. And our high school offered a 1-semester Black Studies course. And that's where I came to that teacher, who was the only Black male teacher I ever had. And I told him our high school paper just never wrote about the kids like me, who were about 20% of my high school, the Black kids who were bused in from the other side of town. And he is, you know, as a great Black educator will do, he kept it very real with me. And that's when he told me, well, go join the paper or shut up and don't come in here and complain about it anymore. And me being an Aries, I will always take on whatever someone challenges me to do. So interestingly, three things happened in that same Black Studies class. One, that's where I fell in love with African American Studies. That class was, in one semester, I learned more about the history and contributions of Black Americans than I had learned in my entire public school career. And I became obsessed with learning this history. It was in that class, or actually after that class, when the class ended, I would keep going back to that teacher and ask him to give me another book. Like I just wanted to keep reading as much as I could. And one of the books he put in my hand was Before the Mayflower by Lerone Bennett. And it's in that book that I first learned the date 1619. So I was 16, 17 years old, and just remember being totally shocked that Black people had been here that long. And I also understood deeply that there was a reason we had never been taught that date. And of course, the title of the book is Before the Mayflower. And it's saying the Mayflower landed in 1620. Every American child learns about the Mayflower. The White Lion lands in 1619. No American child ever learns about the White Lion. And I knew even then that that was important. So I have thought about the year 1619 since I was in high school. Of course, I was in high school only 5 years ago. But so those three things all happen at once. I joined my high school newspaper. I take this Black Studies class, and I come across a date of 1619, and all of those things kind of came together last year in the 1619 project. It also, to me, is such a important plug for high school journalism programs. So many, particularly of our low-income schools and our Black and brown schools, don't have high school newspapers. And I don't know that I would have ever thought about journalism as a career for me had I not been exposed to journalism in high school. And I feel, really sad about how many of our kids, I've spent my time in so many of our Black high schools that don't have journalism at all. And so it's just not even a career that a lot of our kids ever get exposed to, because it was transformative for me.
Yeah, that exposure is definitely important, and then representation of someone being in the business. I was lucky to get a broadcasting job in high school, and it stuck with me forever.
Yeah.
Talking about those disparities in education, I posted something about this the other day. I didn't hear the name James Baldwin until after I was out of college.
Same.
And
I was a Black Studies major.
And then that's opposed to us, like, I didn't take any African American study classes. I was, middle of the road education. But we always heard about Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Rosa Parks. It's Black History Month. And I couldn't recall one time during my formal education hearing about James Baldwin. And then when I saw the video and I read these words, I'm like, this dude he's spitting, and this was 50 and 60 years ago. And the thing that he is saying, it's like he wrote it yesterday. Like he's
absolutely,
And that's, I think, and to paraphrase his quote of, to be a Black person and to be halfway conscious is to be in a constant rage.
Yes.
And so I understand why they did not want Black people here. Understand.
Reading one of the greatest essayists of all time. Yeah. It's funny because I didn't read Baldwin until I was out of college either, and I wasn't really exposed to it. And what I find as a journalist who is a race reporter, you don't actually want to read Baldwin before you write, because you're like, he's already said it. What can I add? Baldwin has already written it. If you feel like you need to write something about how race in America works, and you read Baldwin, you realize he's likely already said it. And of course, he already said it way better than you ever will. So I read them, but not when I'm trying to write, because then I just feel like so insufficient.
I understood. I know.
And it's true also of Frederick Douglass as well.
True. I went to work the next day. I was like, look, I just saw I'm Not Your Negro last night. We're not having it today in here, Not today. So that kind of leads me into a question of being that Black person at work, and particularly I had a conversation with some members of NYBJ about this, and other members of NABJ about, particularly in this given time now, everybody's woke. Everybody woke up. We all put our black dots up on Tuesday, on Blackout Tuesday. We're putting out statements about, we're gonna really make the change. We see it now. We see you now. Roger, I ain't gonna talk about the NFL. we see, oh, that's what you've been talking about, and that's kind of, if you keep it real, that's kind of how it feels. It's like, yes, that's what we've been talking about. And, it's almost seems like it's a safer place to talk about these things at work or to bring these things up at work. But at the same time, those things are still in place. So, I guess the question is getting out is how do you find your voice to say enough with still protecting your job, and not stepping on your own toes, if you will, because, you can't change the system if you're not in it, for one. But at the same time, if you're in there and people are looking at you like, you see why aren't you saying anything? How do you balance that line?
I'm probably not the best person to ask that advice of, because I'm just a very candid person. I speak my mind, and there have certainly been times where that has hurt my career. But I have to live with myself. And for me, like, not speaking up on these things has never been an option. All we can do, though, is try to inoculate ourselves by being excellent. So you can't be the one always trying to speak up, but your work isn't very good. Like, if you're going to be that voice that's calling out your institution, that's advocating for, racial diversity and for change within your institution, then you have to be producing the type of work that is going to make you at least somewhat unexpendable. And that's all I can say. I just, I'm a journalist, but I'm a Black woman in America before I'm a journalist. Journalism is my career. It's not, who I am, though I do feel like journalism is my mission. But we are obligated. It's always interesting in this profession in particular, where we all, by virtue of being journalists, we fancy ourselves as truth tellers. We fancy ourselves as people who stand up to power, who are transparent. And yet when it comes to issues of race, racism, racial justice within our newsrooms, it seems like all of that kind of goes out the window. Look at the American Society of Newspaper Editors decided to stop doing its annual diversity audit because newsrooms didn't want to participate in it anymore. And if you try to bring up these issues, newsrooms don't want to talk about it, even though this is what we're supposed to be as an industry and as an institution. So unfortunately, it's often an extra burden that not just Black journalists, but other marginalized people play in newsrooms. But I don't feel like I have the ability or the right to be silent. If we're in these newsrooms, it's not enough for us to just put our heads down and do our work. We have to try to transform them for the betterment of society.
That's a very good point. I saw Michael Eric Dyson the other day. He was talking about you. He threw out genius and whatnot. And the conversation was around objectivity and, even the basis of what objective is, from about objectivity lives, and how we need to think about redefining what that means in journalism. And when you ask a person of color to cover an event that is a protest, something that is definitely already race injected, and then try to ask them to cover it without injecting some of themselves in it. How do you feel about what the definition of objectivity is, and how journalism uses it sometimes to censor us sometimes?
Yeah, I think objectivity, the notion of objectivity, is a journalistic ruse. It doesn't exist. It's never existed. There's nothing objective about what we do. The very fact that we consider ourselves the fourth estate, the very fact that we consider our job to hold powerful people accountable, that's not a neutral position. Everything from what beats we cover. Why does every newspaper have a police beat, but not a poverty beat? That's not a objective decision. What goes on the front page? Not an objective decision. Who you interview, who you put at the top of your story, what quotes you use, right? So all of these are subjective decisions, and yet we've used this notion of objectivity as a shield against criticism, as a shield against coverage that so often continues to marginalize people who are already marginalized. I live in New York. You read the New York Times. The New York Times does not reflect most of the people who live in the city. That is not objective, right? We are a majority Black and Latino city. That is not what you see in the pages of the New York Times. It's not what you see in the pages of the LA Times. It's not what you see in the pages of the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Chicago Tribune. So I have long rejected this idea of objectivity, and it's often been used against journalists of color. To imagine that white journalists are objective about race, or any more objective about race than a Black journalist or a Latino or Native or Asian journalist. But the presumption is when you look at us, you can see our bias. And of course, that white is normative and has no bias. One of the things that I often talk about is when we think about schools coverage. A few years ago, I gave a speech before the Education Writers Association. And I really lambasted education reporters for not writing about school segregation. We know it's the largest driver of inequality in schools, and yet collectively, education writers who are mostly white women had decided they weren't going to write about this. It wasn't the critical issue. And I said that, that was malpractice, that how do you not cover the primary driver of inequality? That was not a neutral decision. But if you are coming from communities who always had well-funded schools, where public schools were a very positive experience for you, and if you have children who are benefiting from school segregation right now, are you really going to cover those institutions in a way that could tumble the system that has benefited you and your children? So there is no such thing as objectivity. Now, I think, and I've long said this, look at my coverage, right? Like, I'm not pretending I think school segregation is okay, or I'm going to present those who want to maintain segregated systems and give them equal weight in my story as those who want to dismantle them and make our schools more equal. I would never do that. But what I do have is an obligation to be fair to all the parties involved, to present them accurately and to treat them fairly in my stories. And I have to get my facts right. That's what I think journalism should strive for, not a faux objectivity, but fairness and accuracy. And the last thing I'll say on that is, just because I believe that we cannot be objective, I mean, and we all know this, the only thing we're objective about are things we don't know enough about to form an opinion. And as soon as you know enough about something, you have an opinion on it. But that doesn't mean the public needs to know what you think about everything either. So there's a difference between pretending you're objective and openly advocating for or against certain things. I don't want to know what are the politics of the political reporters. I don't want to know who they vote for or who they support. It's not my business, and I don't think the public needs to know that. But I'm not going to pretend that they don't support a candidate or they don't believe certain things. Like, I don't find that useful at all. And it's often been used in a way that has had a negative impact on Black reporters and other marginalized groups. Sorry, that was a really long answer, but I feel really strongly about this.
And it was definitely, informative, because again, it's the thing of, everybody's got a point of view. It's whether you inject it or not, or, what you injected about. Like you say, I don't need to know what the political reporters, who you voted for, but if a particular thing on the ballot is something that you can tell you're against, and it's something that makes sense, then why not make the story more personal? But anyway, we're going to get to some of the chat questions. We are moving on here. So, let's do that. Let me see here. ZZ's iPhone asked, what was the most surprising thing that you learned while reporting on the 1619 project?
Good question. So the most surprising thing that I learned in the project is also the most controversial part of the project, which is that slavery was a motivation for some of the, preserving slavery was a motivation for some of the colonists in Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia who were reluctant to join the revolution, and that the fear that Britain might be ending slavery and freeing some of their enslaved people led them to join the revolution. So when I read that, that was very shocking, which is why I probably should have offered a little more nuance when I wrote that in my essay, understanding that that was going to be shocking to a lot of readers as well. But what was kind of most illuminating about that was, you know, I'm a person who has studied African-American history for 25 years. And I am a person who is highly skeptical of every narrative that we have been taught in this country, because almost always Black people disprove those narratives and Native people disprove those narratives. And yet, I've not really ever studied the period of the Revolution. And most of my study has been in the 1800s and after that. And I realized how much all of us really, even those of us who are very skeptical of the national memory around American history, have bought into this narrative about the Revolution and the purity of the Revolution. I mean, I knew clearly that Thomas Jefferson, that, you know, a lot of them were enslavers and that they weren't pure. But this belief that the ideals and motivations were pure, when in fact, colonists were motivated for a lot of things to join the revolution. They wanted to take more native land, and the King of England had prohibited them from encroaching. So they wanted to leave England so that they could steal more land. Some of them wanted to leave England so that they could maintain slavery. Some of them wanted to leave England over taxation. Some were great entrepreneurs and saw that they could get much richer if they didn't have to pay money back to the colonial power. So there's all these motivations, but we only learn about one, which is this freedom and the idea that you shouldn't be taxed without representation, and that people should have a right to vote in their leaders. That's the only one we learn about. And so I was surprised to the extent that I also hadn't questioned these motivations, and really researching my essay exposed me to that. And what I learned after the essay published was how protective historians of that era are of that narrative, and that there's a reason you don't see hardly any Black scholars who are scholars of the period of the American Revolution. Because what I learned after is that if you wanted to get tenure, if you wanted to get a job at a major university covering early America, and you were writing narratives in opposition to the accepted narrative, your career was not going to go anywhere. And so Black people have largely avoided that field. So I learned all of this after. I didn't realize that that one line in my essay was stepping in a big pile of shit, but that's exactly what it ended up being, so.
And I mean, and that's, you know, kind of the thing where, you know, they say, make it make sense. And I guess that's sells, because, you know, it's like, you know, all the, and again, I'm just in researching to do this, like you said, these men wrote these words, Thomas Jefferson writing these words. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created
equal, endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights. Of these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We don't even have to read it. We know it by heart.
Except for this dude sitting next to me, you know, and
his wife's brother who was in slavery. Yeah. Like think about how we gloss over those facts, right? One, that his wife's brother was in slavery, that his wife's father was having children with a woman he owned and kept them in slavery. Two, that he would then have sex with his wife's enslaved sister and have his own children and keep them in slavery. And yet, think about how we are taught about this man. If he wasn't our founding father, think about how we would think about someone like Thomas Jefferson. But because he is our founding father, we downplay really the barbarism and immorality that required.
And that's why it's so important, you know, in present day for us to have journalists and to have our history preserved, because, you know, again, you know, if you're a scholar and a Black scholar in these times and you're trying to get published or promoted, your words are not making it out. You know, no publisher's going to print you. And, you know, I always say we're so used to our social media and seeing everything and knowing everything. People are voting for president at this time. They don't know what Thomas Jefferson looks like. You know,
He's on the money, man. Come on.
let me try to get a few more questions in. We got to.
Okay.
Well, this is from I thought I lost it. Journalists are often referred to as documenting the first draft of history. Do you see yourself as a historian in a literal sense, a la Eric Foner?
Absolutely not. I like kiss the ground that Eric Foner walks on. He's the one who introduced me to that there was even such a thing as a period of Reconstruction when I was in college. I still have my original copy of that textbook. No, you know, I do some original historical research for my work, but often I'm reading the research of other historians, and I'm an avid consumer of history, but historiography is its own profession. You are specially trained in research techniques, and no, I would never put myself on that level, and I couldn't do my work without the work of actual historians. With that said, we do know that historians and lots of other people use journalistic writing in their research, that when they are trying to find out what was happening at a certain time, they go back and look at the archives of the New York Times, of other newspapers. So in that way, yes, of course, we are truly documenting the first draft of history. But as much as we know about how much we get wrong all of the time, who we leave out, what stories we don't tell, I don't know that I feel so secure in that idea.
And we'll let's toss this one out here. This is what piece of advice can you offer an aspiring social justice journalist?
You treat this work like you treat any other beat that you have. And by that, I mean, gain an expertise. You do investigations. Don't just write about problems exist, but who's responsible? Who maintains these systems? You know, I'm not a good race writer because I'm Black or I care about Black people. I'm a good race writer because I study the hell out of it. The same way that a science writer has to know science, has to be reading science journals, has to understand the literature, has to understand how science works. That is what you have to do if you want to write about social justice. It's not just enough to do interviews and look at data points. Like, you really have to gain an expertise. And if you do that, your work will rise to a different level. You know, when I started at ProPublica, and even before that, I was really determined to show that race could be an investigative beat, that it wasn't just a beat cataloging this nation's inequality, but that you could actually show the intentional ways that decision makers maintain racial inequality, and that you could do it in a way that was allow for accountability reporting. And so that was really important to me. It's just not that interesting to say these people suffer from that, these people suffer from that. We know that. We know it's hard to be poor. We know it's hard to be Black. But how can you actually hold people accountable and show the levers that create these systems? That's what makes your reporting really stand out, and also makes your reporting a public service. So that's my advice, is like, study it like you would any other beat and gain the expertise that you would if you were covering any other beat.
Nice. And I think you went over this, but I'll ask it anyway. How did you come to write about reparations?
So I've been thinking about reparations for a really long time as well. And I wanted there to be an essay on reparations or an essay asking the question of what is owed in the original 1619 project. Tremaine Lee's essay on the wealth gap was actually supposed to use the wealth gap to ask the question of what is owed. But for some reason, it just didn't end up working out. So I always thought that a big hole in the project was there was no, that the whole project is clearly an argument that there's a great wrong has been committed and a great debt is owed, but we didn't make that argument explicitly. So I was actually researching, I've been spending the last 6 months or so researching a reparations essay that I was going to write for the book expansion. So we're turning the 1619 project into a series of books, and we're adding new essays. And one of the essays was going to be an essay I was writing on reparations. But in the last month or so, as I saw, these protests all over the country after George Floyd's killing, and that the protests weren't going away, that the protests were really sustained, and that it seemed that government was, I don't know if they still are, but it seemed the government was actually paying attention to these demands for justice. I just kept feeling like if someone doesn't talk about economic justice, this will be a really lost moment. So I told my editor, I know I'm supposed to be writing this essay for the book, but I really feel like we need to write something. I need to write something right now and insert the idea of economic justice into the conversation. So that's what I did. Now, and I have to say, like, it was kind of crazy. I think I pitched it and then had 4 days to write it and closed it the following week, which I've never written an essay that is almost 9,000 words in that quick of a time, and closed it and published it the following week. But that's what we did.
Cool. So we're running out of time here. So what I want to do, I just want to give you a few minutes. Is there anything you want to just tell the people in the last couple of minutes here before we go?
No. No, I mean, I don't have anything in particular I want to say, except I just think this is a hard profession to be in these days. And, there's a lot of uncertainty, but every single day, I think we can feel confident that the work we do is important. It matters. It is critical for our democracy. It is critical for the most vulnerable in our society. And I'm just proud of everyone on here who is trying to do work that makes a difference. This is an amazing profession. It can be exhausting. It can be scary because there's so many layoffs across the country. But some years ago when I felt like I was being pushed out of the profession and wasn't able to do the work that I had gotten into this to do, I held on only because I could not imagine what else I would do with my life. So I'm grateful every day that I get to do journalism and write the stories that I write, and grateful to be colleagues to you all.
Ladies and gentlemen, that is Nikole Hannah-Jones. We appreciate you so much for taking time out of your evening to have this chat with us. I appreciate it personally, also on behalf of NYABJ, just to have a talk with you. We could have gone another hour talking the government and, the posture and, and again, I'm glad we didn't even really get into that. But, we could go for another hour talking about these things. It's very important for representation. This piece is important in an educational aspect. We didn't even talk about the fact that this thing has a whole curriculum that's going to be, you would talk about that real quick. This is a whole curriculum of 1619 that's being disseminated, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to know why the pushback has been so, visceral, it's largely been because of the curriculum. So we worked with the Pulitzer Center, which the Pulitzer Center turns journalism into curriculum. And when we released the project, we also released a free curriculum that's available at the Pulitzer Center. And it's being taught, the 1619 project is being taught in every state in the country. Almost immediately, Chicago Public Schools, Janice Jackson adopted it as mandatory curriculum. So every high school student in Chicago is learning it. Buffalo has adopted it as mandatory curriculum, Winston-Salem, Newark. So it's been amazing. Before the shutdown, like, killed all hopes of life, I was traveling all over the country and talking again and again to high school students who were engaging with the curriculum, and seeing how transformative it was in the way that they saw themselves and understood their country was just absolutely astounding. So anyone can go online and look at the curriculum and share it with those who might find some value in it. Summer school, maybe.
Some good reading. So again, Nikole Hannah-Jones, thank you. We are right at 7 o'clock, so we're gonna wrap this thing up, but I definitely appreciate it. What's your Twitter handle for people who don't know?
Ida Bay Wells.
As you already know, ladies and gentlemen. Again, on behalf of the New York Association of Black Journalists, I want to thank the Society of Professional Journalists New England chapter. I want to thank Nikole Hannah-Jones for joining us. And good night, everybody. We're gonna, if you have questions, you can email them to the SPJNE site, and we'll try to get back to you with that. But thanks, everybody, for joining. Have a good night, Nikole. It was a pleasure.
Thank you all. Stay safe out there.
Right.